Good afternoon. This year, an imposing bilingual anthology, 1,532 pages, was published by Fordham University Press, entitled Poets of the Italian Diaspora, edited by Luigi Bonafini and Joseph Perricone. The anthology includes over 70 Italian poets living in foreign countries, Europeans, Australians, and those of North and South America. Emanuel Carnevali is completely absent. One could respond, because he was born in the 19th century and is no longer alive. Not at all. The anthology, in the section dedicated to Argentine poets, for example, opens with no less than Dino Campana, born in 1885. One could reply, because he wrote in English, and this is an anthology of Italian poets who, even acquiring in many cases the nationality of their country of residence, continued to write in their mother tongue. If this is the reason for the absence, then we could already shed light on the fact that Emanuel Carnevali wrote above all in English and continued writing in English even after having returned to Italy in the fascist age in 1922-1942. But to consider Emanuel Carnevali unworthy of or deprived of the qualifications for appearing in an anthology of Italian poets of the diaspora continues to seem to me an enormous injustice. That the figure of Carnevali is anomalous is without question, I think. But that in his 10-page introduction to the section dedicated to the United States, Peter Caravetta finds a way of never mentioning Carnevali seems to me a regrettable and even persecutory fact. And that in the over 1,500 pages of a book with such a title, and moreover conceived and published in the United States, the name of Carnevali doesn't even appear, not even in a note, speaks volume about the capacity of Italians, or Italian Americans in this case, of honoring their geniuses. The growth of interest in Carnevali, shown by the Italian public in the last 30 years, has been extraordinary, dating back to the 1978 publication by Adelphi of Il Primo Dio, a volume comprising the posthumous eponymous novel, a dense group of selected poems, as well as some stories and critical writings. Italian interest for an Italian poet translated from English. An interest perhaps more for the figure of Carnevali, seen as a sort of Campana or Rimbaud, more than for his work in a strict sense. With, however, this detail that he wrote in English, making him even more curious and exotic. Today, it's very likely that popular culture will seize upon Carnevali. Many young Italians have heard him mentioned thanks to the rock singer Mimì Clementi, who worked as a waiter in a restaurant in Bologna in the early 90s. One night, a client handed him a book, telling him, "Here is described someone like you." 'Twas Il Primo Dio. Clementi, influenced by him, wrote the words of a song entitled Primo Dio. The piece became one of the songs of the 1995 best-selling album by the rock group Massimo Volume, Lungo I Bordi, and became one of the most listened to songs of the Italian underground. Another text by Clementi, called Almost a God, was set to music by the group Movie Star Junkies. Clementi then tried to show himself as a writer with L'ultimo Dio. It is likely, I said, that the underground culture will take possession of Carnevali. The rock group Accustimantico, in the same year, 2004, recorded the song Emanuel Carnevali va in America. But I ask myself, would this have displeased Carnevali? I wanted to damn my encephalitic eyes, but I didn't damn anything, because the morning was beautiful and there was peace in my heart. On the contrary, the interest demonstrated by contemporary American poets and critics in Carnevali when he lived in the United States, from William Carlos Williams to Ezra Pound, from Sherwood Anderson to Robert McColman to Carl Sandburg, is by now a historical fact, and it doesn't seem to me that the recent decades have produced a renewed interest on the part of American critics in his writings and his figure as a poet. In short, we come across an Italian author writing in English who had extraordinary validation during his lifetime by the American literary elite, and who today in the United States is frankly marginalized. While in Italy he is becoming re-evaluated, above all his figure, thanks to the translations a century after the writing of his important texts. If we add to all of this that his style of writing, compared with that of his Italian contemporaries, is absolutely individual and worthy for us of the highest critical attention, and that perhaps Carnevali is even more fascinating when read in Italian translation than in his original English, we realize that we are dealing with a true unicum in the history of literature. Certainly, the modernity of Carnevali consists in his style, in his astonished gaze, his shocking approach to smells and noises, tastes, colors, especially in the necessity of transmitting his need for goodness into poetry, a shocking consistency strictly linked to his extraordinary biography. Something absolutely 20th century that seems to have ideally assimilated Hume's lecture on modern poetry and, in certain results, even surpassed Pound's Ripostis. On the other hand, Carnevali, as an Italian poet, is more alla Gozzano or more in line with Corazzini. Italy receives this wreckage, my sick body, and this wee candlelight, my soul. And certainly his Italian verse is less original than his English verse, but sure, what is better, according to me, is the Italian translation of his English verse. The fact that in the space of a few years Carnevali managed to learn English as an autodidact in a brief and nimble way, the legend of the New York shop signs is emblematic, and to become a poet and writer in that English language that he defined a dizzy dance and a mad jazz, induces me to think of Conrad or of Charles Simic in our time. But still more startling, it seems to me, is the reception of his bristly poetic style by the American poets and critics of his age. This is the true miracle of Carnevali and of America towards him. He was a child in Italy of separated parents in the first decade of the 20th century, and this is already very American. I wouldn't undervalue the importance of in Carnevali's education of the writer Adolfo Albertazzi, his teacher at the Technical Institute Pier Crescenzi in Bologna. Carnevali ended up there after his traumatic expulsion for homosexuality from the Venetian boarding school Marco Foscarini in 1913, where he had previously been admitted cum laude and on a scholarship. Adolfo Albertazzi was a pupil of Carducci, and a prominent figure in the Bolognese intelligentsia between the 19th and the 20th centuries. Defined by Papini as one of the few marvels of living Italian literature, he could be considered, in his narrative work, a verista à la Maupassant. But he was also talented in mixing irony and lyricism. Such gifts were present in his teaching as well, where he was able to vein his lucid and merciless gaze on reality with poetic nuance. And such talents were quickly absorbed by his very intelligent student, and further boosted by his incandescent impudence. So Carnevali skimmed off the rhetoric dross of the maestro's teaching, however developing his socialist range and freedom of thought. We were in the secular Italy of Mosca and Pareto. In other words, in the sole secular period that Italy has known in its history, and to which World War I and the consequent fascism would drastically end. Between maestro and student, a fundamental and stormy tie was formed, with Albertazzi, who had well understood the immense potential of Manolo, and Manolo, who pushed away an attempt by the maestro to discipline his anarchy as a method of learning. The result was that the 17-year-old who departed from Genoa for America in 1914, the year when Mario Luzzi and Dylan Thomas were born, was not at all a naive, either in terms of literature or life. Isolde is a poem of grace and beauty. She opened my heart, and with her beautiful hands she threw inside a handful of love, one reads in Primo Dio. And again, my comrade Giovanni is a true love, fervid, passionate, stupendous. When I held his hand, I was happy. Manolo was fascinating and sensual. He also had immense literary powers, in part already even demonstrated. The miraculous fact is that in the space of a few years he was able to transplant them in another language, and have himself respected for his style and his genius in another culture. How did he achieve this miracle? Thanks to his education, his intelligence in literature, and his courage, certainly. But also thanks to the particular moment in which the other culture arose in 1914 and in the immediately successive years. As Luzzi himself would later write in Vicissitudine Forma, poetry happens through a synthesis between two orders of perception or universes of discourse, when an emotional state and an artistic capacity and a specific moment, that one and not another, of a universal being coincide. We have spoken of the emotional state and artistic capacity of Emanuel Carnevali in 1914. Let us remember that the first anthology of Des Imagistes, edited by Pound, was published exactly in 1914, and that the following three anthologies, Some Imagist Poets, edited by Emil Lowell and J.G. Fletcher, appeared over the next 3 years, and that the axis New York-Chicago on which Carnevali moved was the right one. Proportionally speaking, it was like finding oneself on the axis Florence-Pistoia during the year of Hermetic poetry. And that the bitter critiques, to use a euphemism, that Pound reserved for Emil Lowell when the successive anthologies were published did nothing else but add further polemical interest to the situation. Although living on the margins of society, the dishwasher, drugstore boy, waiter, street cleaner Emanuel Carnevali, who, however, had studied Latin and French and had appropriated all the metrical forms of Italian tradition, learned English through suffering, and he fell in love with it. The bastard language worked so well for the poetry that he had in mind, and Manolo began writing even more of it. In any case, the money to buy envelopes and stamps he got by shoveling snow. So those verses delivered to the editorial desks of all the literary magazines that Manolo found at the bookstore end up being read. And here returns the Lucian specific moment of universal being, which allows a poetry magazine to reach the tables of bookstores and maybe be edited by Ezra Pound. And Manolo entered into contact with Max Eastman and Robert McCollum, and associated with William Carlos Williams, who would then mention him in his 1951 autobiography, and Sherwood Anderson, who would dedicate to him his 1941 story Italian Poet in America. It would be Anderson who would tell when and how Manolo lost contact with the reality. It was a snowy, freezing night in Chicago, and Manolo went to find him after months in which they hadn't seen each other, wearing only a shirt, and asked him if he wanted to take a walk with him. Anderson refused, and Manolo went away, alone in the snow and the freezing night. Manolo also translated and collaborated with others, succeeding, however, in getting the journal closed down after an editorial meeting in which he let himself go and accused his colleagues of being nothing other than rancid library mice. But now the American avant-garde had learned to recognize and was at the right historical moment to appreciate and even overestimate the shrill originality of Manolo's wild style. He was defined by the avant-garde as the black poet, owing to his anarchic and rebellious character. He who preferred white. After abandoning New York and abandoning Emilia Valenza, the girl with Piemontese origins who became Mrs. Carnevali in 1917, Manolo conducted his new, penniless life in Chicago. After a white period, childhood, and a pink period, adolescence, when the black period, corresponding to the 8 American years, opened up for him, his obsession for white also began, until he would claim to wash himself in milk, until he would declare that no one would be able to make him blush, until the famous slap he received from his wife that made his face turn scarlet. But there were also flashes of light in his life. For example, in 1918, while his contemporaries in Italy were getting killed on the Carso in World War I, Emanuel Carnevali won the Young Poets Prize given by Poetry magazine, with the consequent publication of his poems in the prestigious journal. The editor of poetry, Harriet Monroe, fell madly in love with him, so much so that she had him come to Chicago to work as associate editor of her magazine. It should be remembered that Harriet also visited Manolo during his illness in Italy, when on a trip to Europe. That same year, 1918, Carnevali was hired as a secretary to Joel Elias Spingarn, rich academic and literary critic, lover of Italian culture and friend of Benedetto Croce. Spingarn subscribed to the Italian journals La Voce and La Critica. In just a few weeks, Manolo read all those journals and decided to enter into epistolary contact. He was 21, let us not forget, with Palazzeschi and Prezzolini, Zlata Perensofici, Papini, and here re-emerges the influence of Albertazzi. On the request of Spingarn, he also began to translate Croce into English. But it didn't last. Manolo, who hadn't supported the strictures of his father, officially the prefecture, of those of Professor Albertazzi, certainly hadn't come to America to be bridled by a rich professor and a frisky poetess. Too much suffocation, too many unproductive conversations on uncomfortable armchairs, too much tea and cake. Too much, to say it with the words of his first title, Splendid Commonplace. However, he did truly write his letters to Italian intellectuals in those months and continued to write them even after his return to Italy, which, under the spot-on title Voglio disturbare l'America, were partly published by Gabriel Gaccio Millet in 1980. His other associations remained those of always: street children and prostitutes. Even if he had by now entered into the right literary circle, and a brutal synthesis in English of his stupor and his consternation fascinated the poets endowed with pedigree to the point of having him participate fully in the renewal of the American literary avant-garde. Among his Italian correspondents, Carnevali comes to full circle with Carlo Linetti. I use this expression because Linetti was an Anglophile when Mario Prats hadn't yet won the chair of Italian in Manchester and that of English at La Sapienza in Rome. Carlo Linetti, today misunderstood as much as, and perhaps more than Carnevali, was a pioneer of the great translations from English. For example, he translated Stephen Hero into Italian, the young unfinished novel by Joyce, which converged into the portrait of the artist as a young man. And Carlo Linetti himself was the first extensive critic of Emanuel Carnevali. In 1934, an acute essay on the American poet under Linetti's name was published in Nuova Antologia, together with some accurate Italian translations of his poems. Few things interest me and please me more in the art of Carnevali, Linetti affirmed, than feeling the spirit of our race beating in the wave of his English prose, the unmistakable rhythm of our perception. Aside from the dated vocabulary which Linetti used, we believe that his critical intuition is truly ingenious, especially where he defines what Carnevali put into practice as a spiritual transplantation. Carnevali's first book, A Hired Man, was published in Paris in 1925. This is the sole volume that Manolo was able to see during his lifetime, except from an excerpt from Primo Dio in 1932. The setting for this book was that of Americans in Paris, and the editor, Robert McColman, who together with Carnevali edited the French publication of Hemingway, wanted A Hired Man to be a sort of Zibaldone, including reviews and essays, besides stories and poems. This was a summa, then, of Carnevali's writings, which appeared thanks to the admiration and esteem of men and women of the other culture. It was published at a time when one knew that the health of Carnevali at 28 years old was compromised forever. At almost a century of distance, we can affirm that A Hired Man matches Il Primo Dio, published in Italy in 1978, in terms of its being a summa. If we attentively consider the dates, Robert McColman and the presentation with Hemingway for Carnevali's first publication in English in Paris, Adelphi for his first Italian publication, we must affirm that no writer could desire anything better for his start. However, in the middle of all these years, there was a half-century of oblivion, with World War II in the middle, and Carnevali, who was dying when the Italian soldiers were freezing in Russia and Pound was imprisoned in Pisa. Carnevali, the anarchist who, wasted by syphilis and lethargic encephalitis, managed to have his return to Italy coincide with the appearance of fascism. Oh Italy, oh great boot, don't kick me out again. And his vilified father, a law and order man, emblematically waited him at the port of Genoa. But Carnevali would succeed in almost making his absurd death, the infamous piece of bread, coincide with the fall of fascism. It is in a letter to Harriet Monroe that Carnevali claimed that I want to become an American poet. I don't like Carducci, still less D'Annunzio. Speaking of American authors, I have read quite deeply Poe, Whitman, Twain, London, Oppenheim. I believe in free verse. I try not to be an imitator. In fact, more than anything else, he would be imitated. No one, for example, will remove from my mind the doubt that Dylan Thomas knew his work. The sun that between the two curtains enters into my room with the joyful fury of a victorious dagger brandished by a daring boy. Drôlatique sérieux. In truth, it is not difficult to find the Italian origin of many expressions in Carnevali's poetry, which are non-existent in English. Italian words and expressions which in English end up appearing stressed, pushed too much up or too much down in the ideal pentagram of the language, not only poetic. But precisely because of this reason, they made a profound impact on the imagists and modernists aiming in primis for the renewal of traditional poetic diction, transforming this characteristic mismatch of Carnevali's writing into one of the strengths of his poetry. We realize this perhaps more today, in particular when we retranslate these verses into Italian. The end result is that they seem to be poems originally written in Italian, but coming from another planet. I come from America, the land that gathers the rebels, the miserable, the very poor, the naive skyscrapers, votive candles at the head of Manhattan. I remember Manhattan Island crowned with dogs. I come from America, where everything is higher but less majestic, where there is not wine. With his usual sharp taste, Carnevali declared in a rare interview granted many years later in Italy that I don't know how to write in Italian. The language is a creature, blood, nerves, muscles. It's necessary to know it. And again, English has assumed for me the aspect of an Italian dialect. Carnevali's way of thinking in its pure state, dissociated from the desperate and desperately 20th century style, belongs rather to a man of the 19th century, who speaks to his hypothetical readers of social aggregations who had no doubts about the existence of God. while he had those doubts. In New York, he spoke of theology with the daughter of a Presbyterian pastor. He told her he loved Christ, but that Christ is the negation of any Christian sect, of all the Christian religions. And in Primo Dio we read, Christ has never ceased to be immense for me, and I think that the Gospel is the most beautiful book that has ever been written. Of all the paraphernalia of the divine has done nothing other than damage that splendid man who was Christ. Religion is always wrong, Christ is always right. In another passage from Primo Dio, Carnevali is even more explicit. I've never believed in God, not even as a child. And when I pronounce the word God, it is only a sentimental symbol. In one way or another, God hasn't found room in my spirit. As he wrote to Carlo Linati in 1934, I suffer very much, and since I do not believe in God, I also lack the comfort that, I do not deny, religion could perhaps give me. We are too small to have religion. A gaze at the sky makes us think how we are ashen worse. On the other hand, and this is known, when one's health awakens, the phantasms of childhood returned magnified. And if there are divine mythologies among these phantoms, these mythologies reappear insistently in nightmares and deliriums, and therefore also in poetry. Thank you.